Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery and I've got some worm bin maintenance that I want to tend to. So I figured I would create a little illustration of what I've got going on over here, just to help put things in perspective a little bit. It was in the beginning of July. We're now in the middle of September, so it was about 2.5 months ago that I decided it was time to take my outdoor worm bag, which I've got depicted over here, this little bag here. So 73 days ago, I decided the time had come to harvest the castings out of that bin, relocate the worms, and I used my screen. This is my little illustration of a screen. The screen allowed really fine stuff to drop through into this big container down here, and this big container down here is attempting to illustrate that box that you see down there on the floor. That box has been holding onto the castings from my outdoor worm bag for the past 73 days. The reason I just held on to it and didn't just use those castings directly in the garden was because I assumed that stuff was loaded with worm cocoons. And I figured given enough time, we'd end up seeing a bunch of worms start to hatch out of those cocoons. So the other thing that happened here as a result of screening that material was that a lot of this stuff got caught up in the screen, which I held on to for just a few days. I threw it all into a big pot. And then about 5 days later, 68 days ago, I had launched off a new environment using those worms. I had created some nice fresh bedding for them. I relocated the worms into there. I did a light harvesting to separate those worms from all that large chunk material that they got caught in the screen with. And we had estimated that launch of worms into that little green box to be about 1,000 worms. And actually, you can actually see the green box that they used to live in. Is right over there. But the population, as of 15 days ago, got relocated from that green box into a regular sized bus box, which you see right there, smack in the middle. And we've actually started hauling worms out. So it was a week ago that we went into the box over here with the castings, and now with a bunch of baby worms in it too. And for a while we had already been baiting. We had set up a little bait station, and we found about a week ago that we had, pulled out a whole bunch of worms from there. And with the help of the viewers, I've come up with an average number of how many worms we did the haul out last time. It was 403 worms is what we estimated based on everyone's feedback and the averaging of those numbers. And after a week, after we had reset that bait in there, I wanted to see how things are coming along in there. So I was going to see how the baiting of the baby worms out of this finished compost is coming along. Who knows, maybe we're near the end. And then I figured, after a week, this box over here is ready for a feeding as well. So that's my game plan for today. I'm going to put on a glove and get these boxes up onto the bench, and we'll get to work. So now it's a box like this that we had used to set up the bait station right down here in the middle of the bin, with some yummy stuff like cantaloupe and banana peels and a lot of the leftover bedding materials that had already been in here once before when we set up the original bait station. So when we hauled out the worms last week, the box that was the same as this had already been chewed up so much that it was barely recognizable. I think there were chunks of it that were maybe about this big, half the size of my palm, but all the rest of it got all nibbled up and fell apart. And it was all collected and put back in as the bedding for the fresh food that was put in a week ago. And then we even threw in some grit, and hopefully it's doing a good job bringing the worms together. So let's take a look in here. I didn't really plan on doing another haul out today. I just wanted to see how things were coming along, since I was going to be feeding the companion bin that goes with this one, which is where all the worms get relocated into once we do succeed in rounding up some worms from here. So we're just going to take a peek in here, see how things are coming along. I'd also like to somehow get a sense of how many baby worms are still occupying this material, because for the longest time they were just left to forage throughout the remaining bits of food and whatnot that was in this material. And it was only during that last attempt to round up worms that we had presented them with some nice fresh food to go after and to be drawn to, so that we could try to haul some of them out. And here too, the food that they were just given last time a week ago is pretty much the only true feeding that they've received recently. Now I'll I'll mention also the fact that I was down here last night. I was just curious to see how things in this bin are coming along. So out of curiosity, I went ahead and I just sort of disturbed all the material here on the top surface, and I ran a little short time lapse to see if there's any visible movement. You saw some of those little roly-polies cruising around, some of those isopods. Those I'm okay with. I don't mind having those in my worm bins. So when I see them, I don't sweat that, but if I see something else that I can't really recognize, I usually just prefer to do away with it. So I must say, not much difference here. I do notice though that the, or at least it looks to me like the crushed eggshell that I had sprinkled on top over here might have already been all collected up, or for the most part been collected up by the worms as they made their way into here. Although there's still some of it left, but I think there was quite a bit of it sprinkled on top of both containers. There's a worm, there's another worm. I'll admit also that when I was in here yesterday to do that short time lapse of the surface of the material on top, I did also go as far as doing what we're doing now, which is just to peek in here, see what kind of a turnout we're getting. And it just seems to me like the predominant turnout here is basically little tiny baby worms. Here and there you see a kind of a larger, maybe still a juvenile aged worm. But when I looked around in here, it did seem to me like we had a whole bunch of little babies cruising around. And I didn't, like I said earlier, I think I mentioned that I was not planning a haul out today. Since yesterday I did notice that there was still leftover banana peel right here. And this is that cantaloupe rind, except on the cantaloupe rind, I don't see any of the fleshy melon itself. I see a little tiny baby worm right there, and another baby worm who's not quite as small right there. Not sure if the camera's picking it up. So it does seem to me like they're turning out, getting attracted to the food, they're eating the food, making use of the grit that I gave them as well. And that's exactly the objective here. And you know, this cardboard covering here was really meant just to prevent all these castings from flowing into these little containers, to help it be a little bit easier for us to look through here when we returned into here to see what's happening. So here too, I could see a worm or two. And I would think that a lot of the worms that are in here are ones that I'm just not going to be able to see because of their, you know, tiny size. Because I do spot one or two of them here and there once in a while, but they are very small. So when the time comes to haul these worms out, it might be somewhat difficult to estimate how many it is that we succeeded in luring out of these castings. But it does look like they're in here in pretty good numbers. And it does also seem like as I work my way down, I see more of them down low. It's like a little jumble with a few little tiny baby worms in here. So, okay. The other thing I did here yesterday, just for full disclosure on what my off-camera activities down here have been relating to this process, I was definitely interested in seeing the worms, you know, come here to, you know, react to the bait that I put out here for them and to come for it. So I wanted to, you know, make this into a really cozy spot for the worms to gravitate towards. So the only other thing I did yesterday when I was in here checking stuff out was I came in here with my spray bottle and I dampened both of these little boxes to make sure there's a lot of moisture here. I also dampened this cardboard just to make this kind of into a damp zone, so that maybe if worms are cruising through this dry material out here, that they might sense the moisture nearby and head over to it and stay because of the food and because of the great company. But that's really all I was hoping to do today in this box. No haul out, no refreshing of the food, because it looks like we've got plenty of food in there. So we'll make our way over to the other box to feed that box, which at this point has, I don't know, we originally estimated 1,000 worms in that original haul out in the very beginning when we first populated that bin, and then that new 403 additional worms that we thought that we hauled out during the last check-in a week ago, brings us to a population in that other bin of, I don't know, it's hard to say, but an estimated 1,400 or so worms, which I'm not sure where we're going to end up. But if you look at the material and you look at the, the turnout in here, it does seem like we've got ourselves a good number of little baby worms collecting in the bait station. So when the time comes to finally bring this process to a close, and I believe when I do that next haul out, that will probably be the end of the road for this process. At that point, I will truly see this as a box of finished castings. Castings which over here on the edge are actually drying out quite nicely. They're super fine. They've been super fine since day one because they always flowed like this. Didn't really require any drying or anything like that. Stuff has always been really tiny particle matter, flowed right through my sieve, through my screen, and has always been nice and loose like this. Perhaps drying a little bit over time since it's been removed from the bag. So let's get this thing covered up and let it continue a little while longer. And I guess the decision point here is going to be how much longer. How much longer do I want to continue with the baiting of the worms out of this material? When am I going to be satisfied with the fact that, the worms have probably exited it at this point and made their way to the food? Maybe I'll come back in here occasionally to, look through here and perhaps disrupt the material a little bit again and see if using perhaps another time-lapse clip to see if I observe any movement. But like when I did that yesterday and I kind of tilled everything up and I left the top surface alone while the time-lapse was filming, I saw a couple worms here, maybe one over here. I think I saw 3 little baby worms kind of hanging out on the surface, caught up in the tilling of the material that I was able to see because of the time-lapse footage revealing their movement. But it certainly didn't seem like much, so we might be pretty close to the finish line on baiting the worms out of this finished compost, and at that point this stuff can be used out in the garden or whatever, and then we'll be done with the whole, what I refer to as the cocoon nursery process for this container. So let's go get that other box that's got the actual worms in it, and then we can give them some food. Okay, so this box is so much lighter than that box full of castings because the castings are usually pretty heavy. A lot of times I believe that the weight also has to do with the fact that they're usually pretty damp and have a good moisture content to them. Those castings that we just inspected are actually drying out a little bit, so they're not quite as heavy as they were in the beginning. Okay, buddy, what are you doing out here? This guy probably just came out for a little sip of the water that collects underneath the plastic. We'll get him back down into the bed. Actually got 2 pieces of paper here to be removed. Oh yeah, and then underneath we've got a good number of worms hanging out. Once again, probably drawn to the moisture that collects due to the plastic coverings. And I usually run plastic coverings in my newer bins, but once I feel pretty confident that the material in the bin is pretty dense in terms of castings content, which have a great ability to retain moisture on their own, I'll do away with the plastic coverings at some point when I feel like the material in the bin is capable of hanging on to its moisture without help. But in the beginning I tend to try to help the bin hang on to its moisture by keeping plastic coverings on. And all this nice material here is the stuff that the worms were hauled out in, so I actually did scoop all the stuff out and put it into a plastic container, so it includes large chunks of the old cardboard box that had been there before, the ones that you just saw there, and all the food that was still in there, as well as all the worms and all the castings material that was surrounding it too. So I didn't try to selectively, keep these castings separate to put them back into the box that has all the castings in it. I just figured let some of this material go with the worms over into their new home. Some, familiar material that they've been occupying so that the transition could be made easy for them. This is a rubber band. It's funny, I so rarely find rubber bands in my systems, but this week this is the second one I found already. This is falling apart, so I don't think this is a rubber band, but this definitely is. So, pulling it out, oh, it's two rubber bands. Pulling out the rubber bands, they don't belong in the worm bin because they'll never break down. Or although, you know, maybe that's not true. Maybe the rubber will eventually dry out and break apart, and who knows. I guess rubber is a natural product, right? Latex out of rubber trees or whatever, I don't know. But I'm sure rubber bands are not purely natural material. I'm sure there's all kinds of chemicals and plastics and who knows what added to it. So to me, rubber is not something that I would normally try to compost down in my worm bins. So I always pay so much attention to what's going on with the cocoon nursery and the haul out of the baby worms and everything that I sort of lose track of what's really going on within the actual worm bin here. I'm trying to refresh my memory here as I go through to see if anything reminds me of what we fed in here last time. Maybe when we encounter the old foods we'll better remember what was put in here. You could see there was a good amount of bedding used recently, bedding in the form of both paper and leaves. You can also see some of the bedding I was using while the bin was still outside. I was using some grass clippings. There's a whole variety of different types of materials in here, and I gotta say, some of the material down here at the bottom seems a bit dry. And you would think right here alongside where the foods had been added that the material would be starting to get a little bit more damp, but it's really very dry. I didn't really bring any food down yet. I was going to just selectively choose certain things from the freezer based on what I thought that this bin needs. And maybe it would be a good idea to selectively choose some stuff that's got some good moisture content. Or maybe I could just do what I do sometimes, which is just pour some water right into the bin. It might sort of pool up at the bottom for the first couple days or for the, in the very beginning. But in time that moisture will just dissipate throughout the rest of the contents of the bin and help dampen all the materials in the bin. And it does seem like that would be a pretty good idea. Definitely not seeing any signs of the food that they got last time, or at least nothing major. Maybe I could feel little scraps of sort of gooey, damp stuff that's still not completely consumed or broken down yet. But it would appear that after the past week, the food that was put in here has all been consumed. This does seem to be a pretty hungry bin. Although who knows, maybe the feeding they got last time was not much, or maybe it was just the types of foods that get eaten very quickly. I don't really remember. So I think when we drop in the food, we'll have a chance afterwards, after we've covered up, to maybe see how things on the outer edges are looking. Hopefully things aren't overly dry out there too. So I think I'm going to take a little pause right now to go fetch some food from the freezer. And I'm also going to get my water bottle out here. Maybe not to squirt water into here, perhaps just to pour water straight in and let it go to the bottom. And then over time I'm confident that that'll just, equalize and help dampen some of the dry stuff that we see in here. So let me go get this stuff from the kitchen and I'll be right back. So now here are the things that I came up with from visiting the freezer. I actually went to the freezer in the outdoor refrigerator, so I've got a refrigerator out in the garage too. And out there for quite a while now I've been storing a number of avocados. I have 3 avocados out there, and the avocados were all cut in half. You can see the cut on this one. And I had removed all the pits out of them, and I had taken all those pits and I had sliced them all up. So if you've ever handled an avocado pit, you'll know that it's like a marble. It's super hard, tough material. But I have found that if I slice up the pit, which is not easy to do, by the way, and if you try it, just be sure you really scrub it clean so it's not slippery and slimy the way it normally would be, because otherwise you're going to almost certainly cut yourself. So I give the seed a good rinse so that I got some good traction while I'm cutting it, and as long as I get that first cut in, I'm able to slice off that first piece off the end, then I can lay it on that flat surface and continue cutting pretty easily without it trying to roll out of my hands or roll across the table. So I figured, since it's frozen, I would try to see if I can separate these two halves from each other. Oh, there we go. I figured it shouldn't be that tough, so yeah, here we go. Like I said, the pits have been removed, or the seeds have been removed from these. And this, along with the coffee that you saw before, is going to become the feeding. But before we add the food, let's drop in the water. So I've already removed the squirt nozzle off the top of the bottle, just so we can pour in the water. And it's something you don't see me doing very often, but I do believe that it's beneficial in this case to add this water, because all that dry material that was in there, plus the dry material we're going to add now, which is just a bunch of dry newspaper. And we're going to get some leaves in here too. This stuff will also help offset the addition of moisture. This will suck up some of the moisture as well. I'm going to drop in some leaves too. You can see this is quite a generous application of bedding. My hope when I combine leaves and paper like this is that by sort of causing little fragments of leaves to get mixed in between the pieces of strips of paper, that the paper doesn't all end up jumbling together into a chunk, into just a big wad of paper. But to a certain degree it's just going to happen anyway. But this is just my attempt to try to help the sheets of little pieces of paper remain separate from each other. It's pretty good. Let's start bringing in the food. I don't know. I have mixed results with avocado. Sometimes it seems like the worms go bananas for it. Other times it seems like the stuff just sits there and never gets the attention of the worms for some reason. I'll be curious to see how this stuff progresses over time. Hopefully the worms take a shine to it and enjoy it and eat it all up quickly, but who knows? Never really know what to expect when it comes to the avocado. So these pits, they'll start breaking down gradually. At first it'll remain whole, and then in time it'll start breaking apart pretty easily. It'll become soft. So it's way different when you cut it up into little chunks like this, as opposed to just throwing the avocado pit in whole. I think it helps a lot. The stuff you see me sprinkling in here is the crushed eggshell that I use as grit in my worm bins during my worm feedings. We'll give them a little bit to go with the food before we drop in the coffee, and then we'll be pretty much done. I guess we could hang on to this coffee filter, because sometimes I like to indicate where I last fed using a coffee filter just across the top. So let's actually set this aside temporarily until we get things covered up more or less, and then we can indicate where we last fed using that. So let's begin covering up the feeding, bringing in some of this stuff from the side. Some of this somewhat dry stuff. Not terribly dry, not dangerously dry. But I'm sure that little dousing of water we just gave the system is going to help a lot too. Here too, you could see dry stuff down at the bottom. But you know, if it was so dry that the worms don't like it, then you wouldn't find worms there, right? But right there on the outer edge, I'm spotting a pretty happy, healthy worm hanging out there. So even though it might appear to be a little bit dry and inhospitable for worm activity, it does seem like going right out to the very edge. We find little pockets of moisture, and I thought I saw a couple worms in there, but whatever. I'm sure that they're probably more focused to the middle portion of the bin where the foods have been getting applied. Once in a while I just stumble on something a little bit larger and I kind of wonder what it is. If it's like, you know, chunks of paper all clumped together, I'll try to usually break it apart a little bit, just so we don't have like a wad of paper sitting out here that the worms can't really do anything with. It'll eventually all go, but I just want to try to help it along if I can. So things look pretty good here. All kinds of large chunks of the original bedding that the bin was built out of. Pretty young bin, relatively speaking, at only 70, how old was it again? 72 days old? I forget. I think pretty soon though we're going to start seeing a lot more activity here as all these little baby worms that we haul out of the cocoon nursery get introduced into here, increasing the worm count for this bin. And as those babies also grow, they'll become, you know, larger with greater appetites. Here too, pretty dry stuff on this edge, very dry. But here too, I poke around and I thought I saw worms hanging out in this stuff. So they don't seem to be too put off by material that's a little bit dry, but if it was more damp, I'm sure we'd see more worm traffic over there. So I got a feeling that that water that we poured in a moment ago is going to help a lot to hydrate all of this dry material a little bit and make the whole environment a lot more cozy for the worms. All kinds of paper, all kinds of leaves, all kinds of cardboard, grass, you name it. The system is just loaded with all kinds of bedding that should make this into a pretty comfortable, cozy spot for the worms. So I just like to sometimes apply a little bit of leafy topping. Admittedly, more dry stuff here. So hopefully that water we added is going to be enough to help dampen stuff in here a bit. But I figured as long as I have my box of leaves here, let's go ahead and sprinkle some fresh leaves out across the top to give the whole bin a nice kind of natural look across the top, as opposed to there being chunks of cardboard everywhere. And as we get things covered back up with those multiple sheets of paper and then eventually the plastic covering, which I will keep on at this stage just to kind of force that recirculation of moisture, we'll hopefully at some point soon end up with a bin that has pretty consistent moisture all the way around and enough castings material mixed in so that I don't have to worry about potentially having the bin dry out just because it doesn't have the capability to hang on to moisture on its own. So in time we'll get rid of the plastic, but for now we're covering up and sticking with the plastic. Alright, well, not much left for me to do here now that we're covered up. I just got a few things to clean off and put away. I'm not going to waste your time with that because that's boring. Before I go, let me just really quickly say thank you. Thanks so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, please remember to leave me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. Alright everyone, thanks for watching. Have a great day.